Okay. You may title your notes then the later Judean ministry. If you remember, we talked about a geographical approach. So the Judean ministry. Okay, this is his ministry in Judea. It's pretty simple. He had his ministry in Galilee. We talked about that before. Now his later Judean ministry. Underneath that, we'll write various discourses. Josh, are you going to do your outlines again?
That'd be great. Do that again.
Okay, so we have various discourses. Okay, so in his later Judean ministry, the first thing we'll talk about is some various discourses that he had in his ministry there. And so keep in mind, when we look at these things, his confrontation with the Jews in particular, and how he does that. He deals with the Pharisees and the religious Jews far different than he deals with sinners, doesn't he? And so we're going to look at these things, and he's going to start to ramp up his contention with them. It starts to ramp up and ramp up and ramp up more and more. Earlier in his ministry, he would, I don't want to use the word flee, but he had a different intention. So he was intending to begin his ministry, and so he grew in popularity, and he was also intending to choose his apostles and to train them. So for him to be in contention with the Jews at that time did not benefit what he was doing. So he kind of retired from that sort of thing and really didn't confront them too strongly. But once he gets to Judea, and certainly after triumphal entry, as I said before, gloves were off. Okay, no holds barred. And he was very, very direct with them, calling them white painted sepulchres and all the rest of that. And so he starts to ramp this up, and of course it would eventually lead to his death. Okay, the discourse on humility here we have in Matthew chapter 18. So that's the first thing, the first discourse on humility. Okay, now I'm going to have to really go fast through this because I took probably too much time in the rest of it. Okay, so in a general sense, what we have then is, let's start in verse 1. At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? All right, so that's a question. Who's the greatest? And Jesus, I think of Muhammad Ali. Anybody even know who Muhammad Ali is? Yes. Actually known as Cassius Clay, correct. And he used to say that, I'm the greatest. He used to say that. So when for some reason, that's what enters my mind when I see that. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him. Now, this is a very vivid example. So he's having here a discourse with whom? With his disciples, right? So they're asking who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He brings a little child unto them and set them in the midst of them. Like if you could picture this in your head, right? Hey, Lord, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So he brings it's a little child. There, teknon is the Greek word for child, and brings a little one there. So we can assume that it was probably a child that was maybe not an infant, but not somebody that was walking too well. At any rate, a little child. And he said, verily I say unto you, verily or truthfully, I say to you, notice the authority in his teaching always, I'm saying to you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. That phrase, kingdom of heaven, is very significant in the book of Matthew. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now, how did he know that little child was humble? Because that's a characteristic of little children. All of them are. And whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receiveth me. Okay. So this reception of a little child and also the behavior of a little child. So he's giving here a discourse on humility. The occasion for this, now let's look at the setting, right? We're looking at the setting of it a little bit, or the occasion, or what occasioned this question. Well, there's some debate maybe about that. The verses right before, verses 24 to 27 of chapter 17, gives us maybe a hint to it. And when they were come to Capernaum, now this is in Galilee, right? They that received tribute money came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? And he saith, yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Peter saith unto him, of strangers. Jesus saith to him, then are the children free, notwithstanding, lest which should offend them. Go thou to the sea and cast in a hook, and so forth. Okay, now what I want to bring your attention to is what did they say there? They said they were made to believe that they were children of who? Of a king, right? He knew that Christ was really making reference to them as being children of a king, right? So then the question in chapter 18 is, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Kind of seems to follow what they were talking about. He just called us children of a king. That means we're princes. So that means we're great people, right? So it started to get into their heart, which is not God's intention. It was not Christ's intention at all. So he had to bring them down from their high horse, so to speak. But it may have been a resulting of what Christ said there before. They took it the wrong way. Now, in the book of Mark, we have a little bit more of an understanding. In chapter 9, there it says that they were saying amongst themselves. Right? So this discussion among the disciples was something that was prevalent even before they asked Christ. And so they were saying among themselves, well, who's going to be the greatest then in the kingdom of heaven? Well, and you can imagine what the discussion was after that. Maybe we could fill in the blanks a little bit. Well, the people that love him most. Well, who will that be? Well, the people that serve him the most. Or the people that followed him, the ones that have sacrificed. How do you vaunt yourself over somebody else in a physical way, by what you can see? Well, it's how much you offer, right? How did the Pharisees do it? Well, when they went into the temple to give their tithe, it was a big deal, wasn't it? And they sounded trumpets, and they liked the high places on the of the parties and all of that, on the rooftops. Okay, they liked to be seen. So the gatherings in Israel were on the rooftops, and they sat in the seat of honor, which would be the seat typically facing the street. And why did they want to sit there? So that people would look up at what was going on there and see, oh, well, look at the person that's in the seat of honor there. This was something that was special to them. So how is it that you vaunt yourself over somebody else? By showing your works, right? By showing how that you're better than somebody else. Can we do that nowadays? Well, we certainly can. You can get to the place where because you've got the right kind of haircut or dressed the right way or that sort of thing, you can vaunt yourself over somebody else and think that you're better. So you have to be careful. And there are benefits, and the truth of the matter is Christians live a higher quality of life. That's true. Just go out on the bus route. You know that's true. But it's not because of you, and it's certainly not because of me. It's because of Christ. So, and Christ loves them as much as he loves us. And so we always have to humble ourselves, don't we? Always. And so God's blessings can be a source of pride if we're not careful. So notice it didn't say, who will be the first martyr of the kingdom of heaven? They didn't say that. They say, who will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? They didn't really link being a martyr with greatness. So what they needed to do is link humility with rewards. And that's what Christ is trying to get them to see. Okay, they assumed everybody in the kingdom would be great. So the object lesson was that this child is brought forth. Now there are four things about a child I want you to remember. You'll see it later on. That helps us to humble ourselves. So it's good to have these things. Okay, what about a child? Number one, a child is teachable by his nature. All of you have kids, of which looking about, sometimes I have somebody in the class that has children. I see nobody here that way, of course. But they always ask, why? It drives you crazy, okay? Why is this? Why do we do that? And then there's always the why of the why, right? And then there was the why of the why of the why. And then there's the why of the why of the why of the why. And there's unending questions, why? Because they want to know. They're teachable by nature. They look towards the parents as the people that know everything. So if they want to know something, you ask the parents, right? It's pretty obvious. Nobody had to teach a child. That's just part of his nature. Secondly, he's simple in his wants. Autumn, our baby, when she's hungry, she cries. She just wants food. That's it. And when she's cold, she gets a startled look on her face. When I first took her out in the wind, it was real cold. She was like, what in the world is this? But they're very simple. Just want warmth, food, that's it. And the change of diaper from time to time, of which I don't do. That is necessary. So simple in his wants. A child is expectant in his attitude. When a child asks a question, what do they expect? Well, they expect the answer, and they never question whether it's true or not. Automatically, they assume that what mom and dad say are true. right? There's no question about it. You've heard kids, well, my dad says this, or my mom says this. Well, they consider it to be true. So a child is expected that. And lastly, is dependent on the father. It really is kind of amazing, the faith of a child. It is incredible. We can learn so much by a child's faith. Very simple faith. They never one time have my children not gotten into the car with me, whether they knew where they were or not. And they never worried about getting back home. They never worried about being protected. They never worried about it, not one time. So sometimes I'll talk to my kids in the car. Sometimes we'll go visiting or whatever. And then it occurs to me to ask them, do you know where you're at? And for the first time, they actually looked out and considered where they were, and they're looking around. Got no idea. Now, to those of us who are driving, that's a major thing. I don't know where I'm at. How am I going to know where I'm going to go? I guess you ask your phone, right? But so but they never worried about it. It never even bothered them. The thought never occurred to them because Dad's in the driver's seat, right? So they don't worry about it. Oh, that we were that faithful to God that way. A simple faith of a child. Wow. That's pretty simple, isn't it? Dad's in control. I'm not worried about it. But we're not that way all the time, are we? God's in control, but we're worried about it. We're worried about it, preoccupied. Well, a child can teach us some things. You see how the Lord's helping them here. So a child by nature is a wonderful object lesson. Of course, Christ being the master teacher shows us this. Okay, now let's look at the discourse on offenses. Discourse on offenses. Okay. All right, so for this continues right here in verse 6 through 14. So now he talks about offending. So he brings a little child there, and he says, you must become as this little child. That is, of course, in faith and in humbleness. And then you'll be the greatest. So here the Lord is linking humility with greatness in their mind. Verse 6, but whoso shall offend one of the... So here's the counter thing. Whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck. I remember going to Israel and see they've unearthed some millstones. That's exactly what it is. And so I have a vivid picture of what the millstone is. And it was where they would make, they would ground things like corn. They would make tortillas. And that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to the man by whom the offense cometh. I love this verse because people like to offend you, and they say, great peace have they that love thy law, and nothing shall offend them. Yes, but Jesus said offenses will come, but woe unto him by whom the offense cometh. What you got? Bring it. So I say. So does that verse mean that you should never be offended, ever? So in other words, I can say what I want to. It's your responsibility to not be offended. Okay, no, it's not what it's saying. Okay, they just want to make themselves feel good. You're the responsible one to make sure that you're not offended. So here the Lord gives a discourse on offenses, and he talks about a little child. Would it be easy to offend a little child? Well, it would be, because is it easy to deceive a child? Yeah. And is it easy to manipulate their simple faith and deceive them? It is, right? You do the bunny ears or whatever. So I know it's stupid, things like that. But the point is, because they're so simple, it's easy to fool them. And people like to fool people that way and to vaunt themselves up in pride. And this is an offense. So this is what Christ is talking about. So anything that causes grief is an offense, right? Guilt, an obstruction to faith. These things are offenses. Okay, and Christ says that they're going to come, doesn't he? Does he leave room for them not ever to happen? No. You're going to be offended. And what he's talking about is he's talking to his disciples. So again, the setting is important because he's talking to people who are going to serve him and follow him. So Christ is saying to us, you are going to be offended. In other words, there's going to be somebody that is going to make you feel bad that you're a Christian. Okay? And this is what he says is going to happen. So we have to react importantly to it. So the teaching is very particular. It deals with the way that we're supposed to react. Okay, so, and the way that we're supposed to see it. So it says here, woe unto the world because of offenses. 8, wherefore if thy hand or thy foot offend thee, cut them off. So what's the first thing that the Lord says in reaction to offenses? Make sure that you're not offending. Okay, make sure that you're not. So although we may feel that offense, we should judge our actions also and make sure that we're not offending. And the idea of the foot and the hand. And if your eye offends thee, pluck it out, cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with one eye rather than having two eyes to be cast in hellfire. So what is Christ really saying in a roundabout way? He's saying that you should make sure that you're not offending anybody, to the point where before you take an offense to something, you should get to the point where you would pluck your eye out and cast it from you before you would offend somebody else. So take heed that you despise not one of these little ones. What little ones? Well, I think the child is still there. For I say unto you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven. So apparently there are angels appointed to Clarence, right? Everybody's got their Clarence. Appointed to them. It's funny how all of you know that. All right, so you hear a bell, right? There you have it. Got their wings. But there is apparently Christ did tell us something. No, not Clarence probably, but that there are angels. Now we know that there are classifications of angels. Just studying through it, actually what the Bible says about it, that there are dominions and thrones and principalities and powers and so forth, right? And so there are angels that are in charge of the powers that be on earth, sometimes evil and sometimes good. Okay, the angels of the churches at Ephesus and so forth, the book of Revelation seems to indicate that there was an angel that was appointed to the churches, right? So now you say those are messengers, and so therefore they're pastors. Well, maybe, but the Bible says they're angels. So, and then we also know from that Satan sometimes has backed evil powers on earth. We know that from Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14. And we know that that's true. And the listing of these things are there. So we have an understanding from the Bible that angels have a task and are appointed to certain tasks here on earth. Right? So when Daniel was praying, for example, and Michael the archangel was called and summoned to go to answer his prayer. It was Gabriel, wasn't it? But Satan prohibited him, and then Michael was called to free that thing. It was an actual physical battle there. And so Gabriel was appointed there. Michael the archangel apparently was appointed to protect the interests of Israel. So we see that in a lot of different instances, that there are angels actually that are appointed to these things. So when we're dealing with offenses, we have to remember, primarily, we have to make sure that we do not offend. Now, when we talk about offending, we're saying that you're purposely trying to hurt that person with your offense. Now, if what we say, biblically speaking, is offensive to them, it is not our purpose, or should not be our purpose, to do that. If the way that they take it is really up to them. But the truth is the truth. All right? So there are three reasons for not offending those people, this little child, which is an example of those which believe. Okay, three reasons. And then this will conclude this part. Number one, because angels are their servants. That's why. They have people watching over them. Number two, because the Son is their Savior. Verse 11, for the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. And then number three, the Father is their friend. Verses 12 through 14. How think ye, if a man have 100 sheep, one of them be gone astray, doth he not leave the 99 and goeth into the mountains and seeketh that which is gone astray? And if so be that he find it, verily I say unto you, he rejoiceth more of that sheep than of the 99 which went not astray. Even so it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven, that one of these little ones should perish. So for these three reasons. Okay. Now let's go to the discourse concerning church discipline. These things seem to be somewhat disjoint, but really it's not, because he deals with humility. Then he tempers this idea of humility with offenses, or he gives an example here, and then he begins to deal with offenses in the church. So there is a link here. Okay. So here, verse 15, and here it continues all the way to 20, very familiar verses. Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, this would be an offense, wouldn't it? So he's giving an example. Go and tell his fault between thee and him alone. He shall bear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and so forth. Okay, and it goes all the way to 20. Now, this is dealing with offenses, but what does he say in verse 15? If thy brother shall trespass against thee. Okay, one of the main things we have is that Christ gives the responsibility of reconciliation to the person that is offended. That is unlike the way that maybe we've grown up or the way the world does things. It would seem that the person that has done the offense should be the one that's responsible for reconciliation. That's not the way Christ did it, did he? It's interesting. Just the opposite. It's the person that's offended has that responsibility to make that right. All right, so that's a very important point here. It's a very important thing that he mentions. And so we're talking about a brother. Now, was more refined and made more precise by Paul. Okay, he calls it a mystery, and so the church begins to be more developed at that time. But a church is a simple assembly. So he's saying in your assembly, if one person offends another one, now, if it's, excuse me, something that's an offense to the church, this is really not necessarily to be followed. This is a personal offense there. Okay, so what are the rules prescribed? These 4 rules. We'll list them very, and you probably know them. Well, let's go ahead and write them down. The first thing that the offended person is supposed to do is to go to him privately. Okay, this is reconciliation. Now, it's kind of a humbling thing, isn't it? So if I was offended by somebody and they personally offended me, it would be my responsibility, the Lord says, to go to that person and to say, now, put yourself in that situation. What do you normally think? If you're anything like me, you think to yourself, that was stupid even to be offended. I'm not going to go to this person. It's a little bit hard to say, you know what, you offended me. That was very offensive what you did, because I feel like a baby. Like maybe I should just not be offended by it. It's not a big deal. Maybe I should just, and maybe that's the point. Okay, because having the offended person go to them is a reconsideration of why you're going. Because in the passions of an offense and all of that sort of thing, it would be easy to justify somebody, but when the offended person comes, now you've got to justify why you're offended. Now you've got to think about, why was I offended? So the Lord kind of builds that in there. Number 2, take 2 or 3 witnesses. So if you go to them, listen, that was what you said there wasn't a very good thing. I don't care, go away from me, I hate your face, or whatever. Then you take some other people. Okay, now I've got to take somebody else with me. So now you better be sure that your offense was actually an offense. Because what are you going to say to this? How are you going to convince somebody, right? You better make sure of it. We always like to use the worst example, right? I saw this person come out of a bar, Okay, that person didn't do that specifically to offend you. Okay, that person should probably just be thrown out. You don't have to go through this process. You understand the difference, right? We're talking about a personal offense. Remember the teaching on humility. So you have to put all of this into context. And then, if that doesn't work, don't care. Okay, whatever. You're a dum-dum, you're a dirtball, get away from me. That's Chicago for you're a dum-dum, right, dirtball. Tell it to the church. Now, that's a pretty shameful thing, right? So now if you're going to bring this offense before the church, being offended, I think you would probably want to make sure that's a proper offense, won't you? You see what's built into this? And then if that doesn't work, that person is to be treated as a heathen. Okay, there is no covering up. In other words, what does a heathen mean? Somebody that's not part of the church. Now, we're going to look at forgiveness here in just a minute. I want you to remember that. In Ephesians chapter 5, who is the head of the church? Christ. And we are members in particular. All right? The word members is in the Bible. And so the point is that where was I going with that one? Yes, sorry. So he's the head of the church. So you have to be part of a church and a member of the church in order to have Christ as your head, right? Okay. So is there a possibility of somebody to be a saved person not part of a church? Is that a possibility? Yes. Of course. So what is the problem there? Well, that person doesn't have Christ as their head. It's pretty important, isn't it? Is it important to have Christ leading your life? Would you say that's important? If I ask anybody right here, is it important? Well, of course. Well, the Bible teaches us that Christ is the head of the church. You have to be part of a church. It's what he leads, where he leads, how he leads. Okay? Whether he leads you personally or whatever, it is always through the church. All right, so if somebody is, if Christ is not the head, then who is? Yeah. Now you look at it that way, okay, you would say, well, I'm my own head. Well, that's what Satan gets you to think. Do you know that the golden rule of the church of Satan is, do as thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law? So Satan always gets you to do what you want to do. All right, and in a roundabout way, deceptively speaking, you're really worshiping him by worshiping yourself. It's kind of strange. The point is, you don't have Christ as your head. So when you look at it this way, you really see the extreme importance of the church. So when this person is expelled because of because of what this person did against you, understand that's a huge. It tempers it completely, because you're risking this person getting thrown out of the church because of something that you were offended by. Then that person then does not have Christ as their head anymore. See, and then they're free for the satanic attacks. At the end of the next thing we're going to see concerning forgiveness, I think that that's built into that one too, and we'll get back to that when we look at it. Okay, now concerning forgiveness. So discourse concerning forgiveness. Okay, so then the Lord gives another thing. Notice that, who's this all given to? This is all for the disciples. Okay, so this is a teaching ministry. And what was the setting? Who's going to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven? That's what initiated all of this. Okay. Now, here we have somebody that that refuses to forgive. All right. Now, how is this progression? Be humble. Right. Part of that humility is making sure that you're not offending somebody. Okay? And then, if you're offended, it's your job to go to that person. So that's going to temper that church discipline. And then we have the teaching concerning forgiveness. So you see how it's all really built in here? Wouldn't it be better just to forgive the offending brother instead of going through all of this? Right? So he deals with forgiveness. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king, which would take account of his servants. And when they began to reckon, one of them was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. That's a lot of money. Even if a talent was a penny, that's still a lot of money. But for as much as he had not to pay, his Lord commanded to be sold, and his wife and his children, all that he had, payment to be made. Is that right? Now, in today's society, that is an injustice. All you have to do is file bankruptcy, and they can pretty much do what you want to do. Right? It's easy. Back then, your life was revolves around your debt. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. So he asked for patience. He asked for time. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion. Notice that. He was moved with compassion. Compassion always moves. And loosed him and forgave him the debt. But the same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants which owed him 100 pence. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me all that thou owest. Now, the next verse. Who was the person, and the fellow servant fell down on his feet beside him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. Exactly what he said. And he would not, but he went and cast him into prison until he should pay the debt. Now look at verse 30. So when the fellow servants saw what was done, okay, this was an offense to who? The fellow servants. Saw what was done, they were very sorry, and came and told their Lord all that was done. Then his Lord, after they had called him, said unto him, O thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt because thou desirest me. Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? And his Lord was wroth. I think that's an IRA, isn't it? Roth IRA? I don't know. I'm sure about that. And delivered him to the tormentors. Okay, now, to the tormentors. My question is, who are the tormentors? You say, well, the people in the jail. I don't think so. And he should pay all that was due unto him. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not every one his brother a trespass. So he's dealing with forgiveness, ultimately, isn't he? He's dealing with forgiveness. He's not dealing with actually going to jail. That's just an example. So then my question is, in lieu of forgiveness, which is something spiritual, isn't it? It's not something physical, like being thrown in jail. It's something spiritual. You can't go and buy 5 pounds of forgiveness, right? You can't. You can't sell it on eBay. So then who are the tormentors? So in verse 21, sorry, I should have given you the setting. But in verse 21, then came Peter and said to him, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Really, this was the setting. Till 7 times? Jesus said unto him, I say unto thee, until 7 times, but unto 70 times 7. Okay, so what broached the subject was Peter's question about forgiveness. How many times should I forgive? And he said 7 times, and Christ said, no, 70 times 7. Okay, Peter trying to apply the Old Testament law there. All right, so this is what was the setting. So he's dealing with forgiveness, and what we really need to know then is this: why? Okay, so we've looked at these things. We've looked at a bunch of different things. I want to discuss something for a minute, and I want you to be able to think through this and maybe put your thoughts down there. Let's deal with this thing first, and then we're going to deal with the tormentors. Okay, my question is this. The sum that the one servant owed the other one was very small in comparison to what that servant owed the king. Right? I think you know that. What was it exactly? He owed him 100 pence, verse 28. That's nominal, hardly anything. So the motivation for this servant to demand of another servant 100 pence couldn't have been the sum. Now, if he owed him 100 talents, then that would have been something. It was just 100 pence. It's hardly anything. Right? So the sum was not the motivation. If it was this much money, okay, if somebody owes you $1, and then if somebody owes you $5,000, of which are you going to be a little more adamant to receive payment? Well, $5,000 cost you a lot more. It just makes sense. So that's a similar situation here. So in our thinking, as we think through it, if it's a spiritual thing, a lot of that deals with motivation. What was this servant's motivation to demand such a small sum if it wasn't the sum? What thinkest thou?
Pride.
Pride. How?
He felt like he deserved it since he was over him, I guess.
Okay, the how does it go? The servant is the borrower's servant to the lender or whatever. Yeah, okay, yeah, that is true. By the way, based on that verse, as a side note, you probably, if you're going to give money, should just give it instead of asking it back again. Josh, you got something?
I think his motivation is covetousness.
He was covetous. Okay, covetous of what? Of the money?
Just in general, he was greedy. Even though he was forgiven, maybe he doesn't have money anymore. I know it's not a real, story, but he just wants to keep going.
Yeah,
Money.
I mean, it could be a real story. I'm just saying it's exemplified. Okay? So you're just saying covetousness in general.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Pride, because there was other servants watching. When it says that the servants, they went back and told the king, so I think maybe he saw them watching and wanted to
Show
demonstrate that
himself.
He had power over
Mm.
so.
Oh, good point. Yeah, Jordan?
I think it's just like self-righteousness, like you wronged me and you need to make it right.
Yeah.
And I think it fits with the context.
Self-righteousness, pride, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point too. It could be something like that. Sometimes the motivation is something that we all understand, but because it's spiritual, you have to kind of put words to it, okay? But yeah, the idea of self-righteousness, I think, is a good point. He's going to make himself look like he's so righteous, like this is wrong. You owe me $1. I don't care what the sum is. You owe it to me. It's right that you pay me. $1. All right, choke him. So it wasn't the sum. It's the fact that he owed it. Now he just was forgiven all kinds of things. What do you forget for all this forgiveness? So what is the point here? What moved the king? Compassion. And this is something that self-righteousness excludes compassion, doesn't it? Okay. the book of Galatians deals with forgiving somebody lest ye also be. Okay? The truth of the matter is anybody can fall into any sin that you might accuse somebody else of. So it is good for us to have compassion. Does that mean that you let the sin go? I mean, what I'm saying is, does that mean that you now consider it right? That's not the point, is it? The idea is forgiveness. Right? Forgiveness. So that's an important thing, that motivation. And then now the tormentors. Well, I think I simply wanted to say that it goes along the lines of the the satanic attack. So when he says that they are to be treated as a publican and a sinner out from underneath the church, we talked about, biblically speaking and doctrinally speaking, they are free for satanic attack. So there's protection in the church, isn't there? The gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So in the same way that somebody would be tormented because they're not underneath the church, I think this is the idea of these tormentors. I think that's certainly there. Okay. All right, now let's talk about the Feast of the Tabernacles. We're not going to get very much done here, but we'll begin it. Still underneath the heading of the later Judean ministry, but that was various discourses we looked at. Now the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, let's deal with this. Introduction. And maybe this is as far as we'll get. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, there are 3 feast seasons in the Jewish calendar. Winter is not one of them, so you can guess what the other ones are. You have spring, summer, and fall. In the spring, excuse me, there were 3 feasts of the Jews. Now, not these feasts were not all required to go to Jerusalem. So keep in mind that a lot of these things were just celebrated at their homes. And some of them in the fall were the ones that they were required to go to Jerusalem, but the other ones were not. So in the spring, Passover was to be celebrated. The Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of First Fruits. The feasts of the Jews very heavily revolved around harvest time and seeding and that sort of thing. All right, so Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. And then in the summer, it was the Feast of Pentecost, 50 days after first fruits. Okay, this is where we get that 50 days. And so that actually was 50 days after the Passover, excuse me. That was with Christ's resurrection, okay, the first fruits. So that had that pattern in Christ's very resurrection. He was 50 days, right? He was 40 days on earth, and then 10 days they were in the upper room praying. Gives us 50 days, and then the day of Pentecost came. So when it says the day of Pentecost, we have this idea of the mighty rushing wind, but in the Jewish calendar, it was their actual day of Pentecost. All right, so the summer was Pentecost. In the fall, there were 3 more. The Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement. Now, here they had to be in Jerusalem. And then the Feast of Tabernacles. All right, so during the Feast of Tabernacles, what we see here, by the way, it was John chapter 7. This is where where we're going to be for this feast. So those are the 3 feast seasons. Now, they commemorate that. Now, we're going to talk about, in particular, about the Feast of Tabernacles. So we have in the spring those 3 feasts, in the summer that one, and then in the fall there were 3. That last one, the Feast of Tabernacles, commemorates 3 things. So in John chapter 7, verse 2, it says, "Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand." Okay, so he would have been in Judea. He would have been in Jerusalem. All right, number 1, it commemorates the sojourn in the wilderness. This is why they live in tents for 8 days. So they leave their home and they set up tents. So in Jerusalem at that time, there were undoubtedly tons and tons, if you can imagine, just probably thousands of tents set up all over the place. And it was for 8 days. It was a feast. So it commemorates, number 1, their sojourn in the wilderness. It commemorates, number 2, the supply of water. What happened in the wilderness in their wanderings? Well, remember, the rock was, is it stricken or smitten or struck? Not sure what the English would dictate there, but then water came out. So it commemorates that, and that's going to come into importance certainly later on when we talk about it. And then lastly, the guidance of light. So the fact that the Lord guided them through the wilderness with a pillar of fire. Okay? The guidance of light. So the Feast of Tabernacles commemorates those three things. So it's a memorial thing. Okay? What we're going to do the next time is we're going to get, which is a good reason why I'm not going to go through quiz 1. Another reason is because I didn't get through the material. But we'll pick it up there tomorrow, and we'll talk about the Feast of Tabernacles, and we'll get into the other lecture.